First, I'm super excited to share the stage with both of you, so thank you, and all of you for coming. So thank you all for coming and listening to us. And so the state of the art, I mean, I think you talked about a revolution earlier. I think the state of the art right now is that we're entering a renaissance in biotechnology. And I like the word renaissance much better than revolution, because it's not that biology is upending the status quo, it's actually going out into new areas that it's never been before. And so we see biology as a technology that can be applied to world-changing problems. Multi-trillion-dollar markets, from the food supply chain to human health, but really understanding biology as a technology that can tackle planetary health as well. And so when we look at that, the fundamental basics are around easier ways of doing synthetic biology, faster ways of understanding our own genome, understanding the epigenetic signatures of what's happening through our evolution, human evolution and biological evolution with other organisms. This is leading us to some of the first time to create synthetic organisms, with the whole genome being created, small viral genomes, but the very beginnings of actually de novo synthetic life. So, and there's plenty of companies, Twist included, that are, creating technologies to make that happen. So there's just a huge amount of progress being made across what I call the common areas of the tools that allow biology going from a research or academic field of study to an applied industry. So as everyone knows, reading genetic information has fallen precipitously, with sequencing costs falling, writing costs are falling. The ability to learn about the biological dark matter that is in us is increasing through machine learning techniques and more powerful computation. So all of these all these technological things are happening at the same time that there are more PhDs graduating every year than has ever graduated before. And each PhD, as most people in this room know, it requires a fundamental contribution to knowledge. And so the overall knowledge of the human knowledge is growing. But there's the problem happens when a lot of these scientists, there's fewer jobs for PhDs than ever before. And so that's led to a great place where we can actually, for the first time, have a low-cost way of starting really interesting companies using biology as technology and apply it to all sorts of problems we've never looked at before. So, that's a higher level version of, the sort of state of the art, but really state of the industry for me.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. It's terrific to be here and see so many friends tonight. Here's what I would say. I'll keep my comments localized to neuroscience in particular. I totally agree with the incredible expansion that biology in general is going through. What's interesting in neuroscience is we can do things like, peer non-invasively into the brain and look at where the activity is, which has revolutionized our field in many ways. But it's also the case that we're still sort of at the foot of the mountain in neuroscience. We have ways to do brain scans, functional magnetic resonance imaging, for example, that can tell us where big blobs of activity are going on. Or we can measure single neurons, single brain cells at a time with electrodes. What we're missing is the technology to measure that in-between space where you have, let's say, 100,000 neurons all doing some interesting dance, some pattern of activity. And we know enough to know that that's where the neural code is. That's where we're going to be able to decrypt the language of the brain. And surprisingly, I never thought I'd be sitting here in 2018 still in a situation where we don't know the neural code. We know lots about neurons. Neurons are essentially binary. They're either sending a spike or they're not. They're either ones or zeros. And every neuron is popping off, and yet we don't know what the language is, which is so weird. I'll just mention, this is just all by way of background. In the peripheral nervous system, we know that, like the harder your muscle contracts, the more spikes you get, or the harder I push it in a sensory way, the more spikes I get. But as soon as you get into the central brain where you're thinking, where you're reminiscing, where you're planning possible futures. So we have no idea how to read that code. So I'll just take the other side here, which is to say, there's a sense in which we've all got high hopes for our roadmap in neuroscience, but we're still a little bit in the dark ages there.
Really interesting, thank you. Actually, that was my second question, so maybe Arvind, you'll take this one. It was, what are, in your field, the known unknowns?
The known unknowns of genetic engineering and biotechnology in general. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of the dark matter, right? So there's huge stretches of our DNA that we don't know what it codes for, right? And it was traditionally called junk DNA. Oh, it must not do anything. Well, turns out that's probably wrong, and nature isn't one to waste things. And so all that is coding, and that's regulatory coding. We're starting to understand that that's really, really important in determining who we are, and that the environment and and people, there's much stronger interplay than ever before. And some really interesting research recently has alluded to the fact that the environment can actually pass genetically through the germline, through signals that go upstream and downstream. So, I think understanding evolution is a big one. The genetic markers of evolution, Darwin helped us understand the morphological or big picture idea of it, and now getting into the molecule side. And that's going to, again, extend biology as a technology across a huge amount of fields, because you'll be able to evolve organisms that do things like eat the garbage patch in the ocean, or alter our cells to be able to change generations of trauma that are hidden in our genes that we might find. So those are like, just on the edges of what's happening. I mean, one thing that, I think neuroscience is really hard. That's what, like, the brain is just a crazy black box, as you were saying, and it's something we're really excited about trying to learn more about. But it is really hard. So that is a huge unknown, as you said. And then, there's actually a bunch that I can go on and on. But yeah, those are some of the big ones that we're seeing.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So now, do you want to add
sure,
more?
yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, some years ago I wrote the cover article in Discover magazine called 10 Unsolved Mysteries of Neuroscience. And they are still just as unsolved today as they were back when I wrote this a decade ago. So very basic questions like, what is consciousness? How do you put together a bunch of physical pieces and parts, like a bunch of cells, and come to have internal subjective experience? The redness of red, or the pain of pain, or the smell of cinnamon, or the taste of feta cheese. This is the kind of thing that we don't know how to program a computer to have that kind of internal experience. So this still stands, but all of that, even basic questions like, why do brains sleep and dream? We spend a third of our lives doing that. We don't exactly know why. What is intelligence? We know that it differs, tests test it. We don't exactly know what it is. We don't even really know how to talk about, how to think about emotions. We think of the brain as an information processing device, and emotions have something to do with that, but they're kind of like a wider lens way of assessing a situation. Anyway, there's lots and lots of known unknowns. And the last one I'll mention is just, I mentioned that neurons seem to be essentially binary with zeros and ones, but there are also these things that are kind of analog signals in the brain, like neurotransmitters that, just sort of change the level of something. And so we're looking at this weird binary digital, digital analog hybrid. And so we don't even know the basic structure of what we're looking at.
One last thing, the other area I think that really will unlock a lot of stuff is just the complexity of interactions within a living organism is just really, really hard to decode. But that is something we know we have to be able to do in order to move forward.
Thank you. Burning steps here a little bit, but we'll come to that in detail. So precisely, let's hop into our time machine right now and move 10 years fast forward. kind of the same question. What is the context? Let's say, what are the high-level, compelling, inspiring, and overarching goals and objectives we have reached in these 10 years?
Hopefully we'll have the technology to be able to, we've got some like 86 billion neurons, and each one of these have 10,000 connections with their neighbors, and so, we're talking almost 1,000 trillion connections, and each cell, of course, is as complicated as the city of San Francisco. It's got the entire human genome in every cell. It's trafficking millions of proteins around, very complicated chemical cascades. So in 10 years, hopefully we'll have better technologies to be able to read this, and I think computationally things are going well, so we'll be able to simulate this in a meaningful way. That's what I'd like to see.
Gosh, in 10 years from now, well, hopefully biology has advanced to the point where we really are solving deep planetary issues with biology. So the food supply chain, for instance, is becoming more secure with creating protein, not from animals necessarily, but from alternative sources, whether that's plant-based or cellular, agriculturally based, clean meats, things like that. All the way to understanding that, where I'm hoping for is gene delivery has finally been solved. That's a known unknown right now, and really, when you hear about advancements in things like CRISPR, for it to really truly have its potential met, it needs to be able to go to the cells in a living system in the right place at the right time, and being able to really nail that down is going to be transformative for our civilization and humanity in general. And I'm hoping in the next 10 years we'll see that. In the next 10 years also, I'm hoping that more scientists and more of this knowledge and super creative, super passionate, and imaginative people will go and create, value-creating companies with their knowledge and with their hard work. And that's something that I'm hoping to see and hoping to contribute to.
Well, we're glad you're here to do that. While we are at it, what are the necessary steps to reach this vision? Like, what are really concrete milestones? And you could, if you have any idea of the timeline for them, maybe you could give them to us.
Sure. Do you mean technologically? What would we need to get it? I'll tell you where I'm putting my chips. I think that the way that we'll be able to do brain imaging will be by sneaking up into the brain. There are a couple ways of doing that. One is by going up through the blood vessels. So, every little piece of brain tissue has blood vessels going there to supply it. And so you can sneak things up there. You have to be super careful about the risk of stroke or things like that, increasing any risk by doing that. But assuming you can take care of those technical problems, what you can do is essentially have little electrodes everywhere that are listening to the brain activity. So it's like you're listening to single neurons, but writ large. The second method of getting there, I think, is with nanorobotics. So this is atomically precise printing. You build little robots, a bunch of carbons, nitrogens, oxygens, and so on. And then, you design them so that they go up, they cross the blood-brain barrier by having the right little FedEx label on them, and then they go and they impregnate the neurons, and then they send little signals, like in a mesh network where they're all talking to each other, and you have some detector on the outside. You can hear what all the neurons are doing. This is a long way off, but it seems theoretically possible. There are companies that are working on this sort of thing now. It'll probably be 10 years before you can do the atomically precise printing at the scale that you need, where you get billions of these in a little pill that you swallow. And then, of course, there's at least another decade of safety issues after that to make sure that no one can hack that system. So there's a lot of problems to be solved, but there's nothing theoretically that's unsurmountable.
Man, that's cool. On the more mundane biotechnology side, I think some of the milestones, right? On the human health side, seeing the modulating the immune system as a modality for treating disease is, and really understanding that on a deep level, so you're not creating allergic responses that kill people and things like that. That will be a moment in which human health changes fundamentally, and it's starting in oncology, but there's no reason it's going to be limited to oncology as a modality. There's other areas, again, I mentioned gene editing and gene delivery, but understanding surface protein receptors, things like that, where selectivity really is understood, and we can nail that down. That's becoming more understood as well. Scaling of biology is another big area that when we're talking about production level of commodities or planetary health, making commodities like wood, but as strong as steel, and then being able to make enough wood that would replace steel. Like, that becomes a cost curve question, and something we grapple a lot about here. And so being able to replicate biology is something that's really hard. As everyone knows, biology likes to evolve in whatever conditions. And so you might optimize for a certain production and then see it change on you. And just optimizing itself is hard. So these are some of the short term, like say next 3 to 5 years, markers that we want to see for long term advances.
That's amazing. Okay, so we are still in our time machine 10 years from now. So could you perhaps, tell us how you see yourself engaging with the field in 10 years, and maybe can you describe the life of Arvind in 10 years, and how it's transformed by biotech, and can you walk us through a day in the life of David transformed by neurotech in 10 years?
You start with David.
Yeah, okay. I know exactly what I'm going to do, which is my big interest lately has been this issue of, can we create new senses for humans by feeding in new data, maybe via unusual channels? So there's this very deep question, which isn't even typically asked in neuroscience, but it's why does vision feel the way that vision feels, and why does hearing feel completely different, and why does smell feel totally different from that? Given that they're all built out of the same stuff, if I showed you a little piece of cortex in a patient who's getting neurosurgery, and you could look at that piece of cortex and see all this activity, you couldn't tell me whether that was visual cortex or auditory or smell or anything else, because it all looks the same. It's the same stuff, playing the same tricks, and using spikes. And yet somehow vision feels so different. You would never confuse these things. You would never see me do this and think that you just heard a sound or tasted something. So my question is, could we feed in a new kind of data stream where the structure of the data is different and you develop a new qualia? Well, philosophers use the word qualia to mean what an internal subjective experience feels like. This is what I'm going to be doing in 10 years, is feeding in new data streams.
Okay, I'm not going second anymore. What am I doing in 10 years? Oh, God. No, I mean, I think in 10 years, our lives have changed fairly fundamentally. I mean, it's not that far out. I mean, I think in the short term, we always overestimate what happens, and then in the long term, greatly underestimate what happens in terms of change. So, at the risk of overestimating, I think, first of all, how we eat changes fundamentally. I went to be a pescatarian for a short time, and when you start eating a lot of fish, you start to go, well, how much mercury has this fish eaten? Like, if you eat fish like once a week or something, you don't think about that. But when you're going on like 4 times in the same week for the 3rd week in a row, you're like, oh, it starts to creep in your head. And so these are fundamental things that you start to actually have to deal with when you're talking again about feeding an entire planet that is doubling in population within the next generation or two. So that's one thing that the technology will come on and fundamentally change. And again, like I said, a lot of other commodities. I think human healthcare will have changed, hopefully both systemically from a political point of view, but also from a technological point of view, in the way we address disease as a personal disease, or at least instead of N being 300 million, N being maybe 1 million. And that allows for a much greater number of drugs to be available, because you might not have a cure for Alzheimer's that is passable for 300 million people, but for a smaller subset of people, it might absolutely work. We're going to see ways of slowing down aging through the mitigation of these types of diseases. And so it's and through understanding metabolic implications. And so all of these things are going to change our lives, because we're going to be able to go out and play more. And I think that's kind of an interesting, like, so what does it all mean? Like, in the end, you get to go out and enjoy life in a fundamentally different way with your family. And that's, like, for me, that's, I think about my 2 little girls about that, right? Like, yeah, okay, cool. I'll be there, and I'll be as fit, hopefully, and be able to spend that kind of time and not have to worry as much about being sick or that future.
Thank you. These are both very interesting fast-forward visions. I look forward to it now. So let's now dive a bit more in detail in the strategic factors that will influence our 10-year outlook. So in addition to the technological challenges that need to be overcome, what are the main societal aspects to take into account for the actualization of our vision? I mean, all of these, or the main one. And for instance, are there some show-stopping regulations that might stop progress, or anything else like that you foresee?
I know you didn't want to go second, but okay. Yeah, there are 2 things to say here, I think. Wait, so hold on, just tell me the question again. It was about what are the, I just had...
It was the technological, in addition to the technological challenge, but
yeah.
Societal challenge.
The societal challenges, I think, are twofold. One is about the affordability of the new techniques that we develop. And happily, the price on that stuff is just plummeting. So one of the worries that we would have had 20 years ago or something was that only rich people will be able to afford XYZ. But I think that is rapidly changing. The other worry, I don't know yet whether it's a worry. I'm chewing on this, but this example about creating new senses is an interesting one, because it might cause something like a speciation in terms of if humans become really different from one another. What I mean by that is, right now we all, probably everyone in this room, shares vision and hearing and touch and taste and smell. So we all sort of get it, we all know what we're talking about, and we use language to transmit, from my head to your head about what we mean by something. And it's close enough that you say, like, oh yeah, I totally know when I look at that red thing, or I smell the cinnamon or whatever. But what happens when, let's say, I develop a completely new sense of the stock market, or Twitter stream, or pilot data, or factory data, or whatever, and there's not even a word in language for it? Because language is only for shared concepts. And so I say, wow, I'm feeling this thing, this other sense, and so I'd have to make up a word. I'd call it schmagegi or something. I'd make up this totally new word, and you wouldn't have any idea what I mean unless you wore the vest or the wristband and got the same thing. And so anyway, given that not everyone's going to be able to experience all the new senses that might get developed, the question is, what is this going to mean for society? Will people go off and have very different sorts of experiences?
Depends if we can plug into each other's brain, and we don't even have to explain anymore.
That seems unlikely. That's not on the horizon, I think. I wish it were, but yeah.
Well, I'm not the neuroscientist here, so fair enough.
So you were asking the sociological hurdles potentially on creating these.
Yeah. Potential
legal also?
Yeah,
technical regulation?
So those are going to be huge in biotech. I mean, huge, because the things that we're starting to play with or butt up against is the design of humanity, and designing humans and designing other organisms. What does that mean? And so from an ethical and sociological perspective, those are fundamental questions that we have to understand and be comfortable with as a society. And also, from a business model perspective as well, there are issues, right? Like, what's the business model of curing a disease and eradicating it if you're a pharma company, right? It's kind of funny. We don't think about that very often because curing disease is what we all should be doing. But the business model of pharma is to sell pills, right? And so when you have one pill that you take once and that is the end of it, what happens? How do you charge for that? How do you, and it becomes such a fundamental question. It's an industry reshaping question. And that's where we're starting to get to with everything I've been talking about before, which is modulating the immune system so you become vaccinated in essence to things forever, or being able to cure things in a fundamental way versus treat things in a fundamental way. So cures versus treatments, right? So those are two, big issues, and leave it at that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, our time is a bit up, so one more question, but it's an important one for us. Foresight's mission is to accelerate beneficial technology, in particular nanotechnology, AI, and longevity. How do you see this technology play out with neurotech and biotech? Which one are the most relevant and interplay strongly? Yes, to begin with.
So what is the technology? Where's the interplay of neurotech and biotech coming?
Nanotechnology, longevity, or AI. How do you see them interplay with biology or neurotech?
Okay, for me, I think one place where it all comes together is in creating consciousness. I mean, I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is we had a company called Komiku that wired a bunch of neurons together and then stuck it to electrodes so you could read the signals coming out. But they had re-engineered those neurons to have olfactory receptors, and so it kind of became a nose. And so one of the things that I was thinking about is, consciousness, AI, all that kind of stuff. Really, what we have are senses that allow us to perceive our environment, and then a brain that allows us to make sense of it, and then have agency through it, right? So one place that you can see it all come together is a nose and ear, touch, and all of those things attached to a machine learning type of processor that's powered by something very powerful like a quantum computing processor, something like that allows you to create, in essence, a living system, or the inputs and outputs of a living system. And that might, who knows, create a consciousness in some way, but that's more of a thought experiment. But I mean, there's a lot of practical stuff that's where things are going into optogenetics, how you turn things on and off, genetic switches on and off using light through the eyes and directly goes to the brain, and stuff like that. But that further out vision is where I think things will eventually, not in 10 years, but maybe in 50 to 100 years get to.
As I mentioned, I think nanotechnology will revolutionize neuroscience. I think neuroscience will continue to revolutionize AI in the sense that we'll have better and better ideas about what we can do with AI. So of course, as we all know, things like convolutional neural networks can do really terrific things like categorize a dog from a cat picture and stuff like that. But it can't do what a 3-year-old child can do easily. Manipulate a crowded room and manipulate adults with conversation and do all the things that kids do. Putting this over here and so on. It's really hard to get AI to do that stuff well, and certainly it's no good at generalizing. So as we actually start understanding the secrets of the brain, that'll just give us whole new ways to understand ways that we can build AI. The last one, longevity, I would just say we're going to really have to figure out the issues about brain disease, because the whole problem, one of the big problems with longevity now is simply that people start having this cognitive deterioration at some age. We're just not built to last 200 years. So that's just more motivation to get those diseases solved.
Thank you so much. And now we're going to take questions from the audience.
3 are already written down, so I'll start with those, and then if we have time, I'll come around whoever is in first.
Okay, great. Do you want to
I'll stay here so I can run around.
Okay, great.
Or do we have a mic that's ableist?
We can hear you, Allison.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first question is, you are each experts in fields which are often invoked by tech optimists as roads to extreme longevity or even immortality. Do you think this, in brackets, brain uploading or rejuvenation, respectively, is even feasible, and if so, when? So I'd be very curious what you said about like mind uploading earlier, because
Yeah, this is a big question in the field. The idea is, can we actually take a very detailed 3D scan of the brain and run that on a computer, and would that be you? Interestingly, we don't know the answer to that. There's good reason to think maybe it would be, and if we took an exact replica of your brain, and we could build it out of anything, let's say beer cans and tennis balls or whatever, but if it's exactly running the algorithms that your brain is running, then maybe that would be you, and I'd say, hey, how you feeling? You'd say, oh, I'm a little cold, I'm a little hungry, or whatever. But we don't know that's true, because in 2018 there's still so many question marks in our field that maybe our science is too young and there's something else that we're missing. So let me just say that in theory, mind uploading should be possible to put it onto a different substrate. The one thing you'd have to make sure you have is brain plasticity, which just means your brain is constantly reconfiguring itself all the time. When you learn that my name is David, there's a physical change in the structure of your brain. That's what it means to remember something. You'd have to build the simulation and know the principles by which things change so that it's not stuck at one moment in time.
The other part of it was longevity, living for a long time, or?
yeah, mind uploads could also be part of longevity, being uploaded.
Okay.
It's generally like, is longevity possible when you reach escape velocity? That's all right.
Yeah, I can answer from the biotechnology perspective around the body, right? There's a lot of talk about longevity as, living for a long time, right? And I think my take on it is a little bit more traditional, where living a long time means you're not dying of something. And right now, as far as I know, there's no one really dying because their cells have reached maximum entropy or something, where the cells themselves are just falling apart. En masse, there's usually something that goes wrong, which causes a regulatory problem that leads to a chain reaction, organ failure, things like that, and you die of that cause. So longevity is still, to me, centered around disease mitigation and control and curing, and that's where we're focusing. And I think that's where most of the industry is focusing on longevity. Now, once all disease is eradicated, then we can start to look at, okay, the theoretical limits of, how long can cells replicate for, things like that, and then we'll start getting into the very fundamentals of longevity, where in a diseaseless state, how do you get the body to stay youthful and last a long time to house, and the brain, like David said, keeping the brain healthy over time.
What are the limitations? What tools are missing?
From what we
progress. What are the tools that you might be envisioning that could help you further your research, but are just not there yet, but might be there, that we will be working on right now?
Yeah, gosh, that's a tough question. I mean, it's a tough question to be precise about because it's really all of these kind of generalized tools. So, from a biology point of view, it's about understanding the interactions within cells, and then how those cells interact with other cells, and then how systems interact with systems, and that's an exquisitely complex interaction. It's actually why I hope where advanced computation along with a loop back to a system you could study and draw patterns out of multidimensional data sets. I think that's giving me hope that it's a tractable problem. But I think those are the tools. So some tools that are missing is living systems that you could study in an ethical way, right? Like I think that's a fundamental. When thinking about the FDA clinical trial process, it's slow and it's hard because we have to do it of course, in an ethical way that doesn't harm people, and that speaks to our lack of model systems that are people.
If I were to take electron microscopy of your brain, really fine detail of what's going on in your brain, and put that together to make this simulation of all the cells in your brain and their connections, that would require a zettabyte of data. That is the total computational capacity of the planet right now. So that's one of the things that limits us, is just the computational power. We're still, you might wonder why neuroscientists are all obsessed with neurons and the way the neurons connect and so on like that, and not the stuff inside the neurons. And it's only because we can sort of measure the neurons that we can't we don't have a special microscope to see the giant cascades of stuff going on inside the cell. So once we get there, it's going to take, a Google of zettabytes to do that. So that's the big technological limitation that I see.
Okay, and there's one on, do you have any speculations on the hard problem of consciousness?
Here's what I say. Yeah, the hard problem of consciousness, by the way, is why does it feel like anything? The easier problem is look for the neural correlates of consciousness, like, oh, when you're under anesthesia, this changes. When you're awake, it's like this. You can sort of identify those correlates, but that doesn't tell you why it feels like something to be alive. No, we don't. I mean, as a field, there are no good speculators. The weird part about this is that we don't even know what such a theory would look like, because all the tools of science that we have are like, okay, carry the 2 and do a triple integral, but okay, there's, but you're not going to ever say, okay, there's the, taste of feta cheese. It's just that language doesn't equal that language of internal experience, and that's why we don't have much progress on the hard problem.
What do you think of panpsychism?
What do I think of panpsychia?
Panpsychism.
Panpsychism is the idea that consciousness is somehow a fundamental quality of everything in the universe, and I think that has to be on the table as a hypothesis. Science always has a wide table for putting all kinds of hypotheses on, and then we use the tools of science to get rid of some of them and open up new folds and see others. But anyway, the weird situation we're in is that we can't knock anything off the table right now.
Okay, and then last question maybe from the audience. What do you think is the most important thing for people to know or do in order to drive pro-social human evolution?
The most important.
What is the most important thing for people to know or do in order to drive a pro-social human evolution?
It's a tough question. I think it's to have a conversation around where are we taking the species, because the evolution of the species will be in its own hand shortly. It's already happening through prenatal screening and things like that. So this has happened, and as of today, we've drawn a line where it is about removing disease to the species forward, and it hasn't really gone into the germline again. So it's on the screening side. And the real question becomes, okay, we talked about curing disease and the business model of curing disease, but now what if you could eradicate it through future generations? Diversity is the most important part of any biological system to survive. And so when you start designing humanity, you start to most likely, if history shows us anything, design to a common attribute set that society likes. And that will, that tends to destroy diversity, and you create a genetic bottleneck. And so then a small shock can now end humanity, right? And so, like, that's the difficult side of having a social, you know, so the social component of designing humans, in a sense, to rephrase the question, would be around, in my mind, around that. How do you maintain diversity from a social perspective?
Yeah, I would say the main thrust in neuroscience is curing diseases, and the Lord knows we need that because there's so much, you know, I mentioned all the diseases of cognitive degeneration, of dementia, and then, you know, even things like concussion, traumatic brain injury, and so on. There are so many things that can go wrong with the brain, and fundamentally, when you lose that, you lose you, and so that's the end of it. So I feel like pro-socially, that's what's going on in neuroscience, and that will continue to go on. As far as the next step of that goes, the things, for example, that we touched on about, you know, building new senses and going off in new directions, or having nanobots impregnating all your neurons, I think the really important thing to do there, just like in any science, is to make sure that we're never moving ahead of our moral compass. And so that means doing things exactly like this and really making sure that as technologies come, you know, so in every generation there's lots of hype about the technologies that might happen, but nonetheless, getting the whole crowd ahead of things so they see what's coming, they can legislate appropriately, and so on. That's going to be as critical into the future as ever.
So right now we are actually out of time for questions. So the next one, please just grab a card from the person that is giving out cards, and then you're able to ask the question. Like right now, instead of me down here, so I really encourage you to use the card. And yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions. They were really good, and thank you so much for your answers. I'm going to leave the floor to Allison. I look forward to one day discovering if the taste of feta cheese is the same for everyone, and also discovering what dying by having our cells reaching maximum entropy looks like. That sounds very interesting as well. Thank you very much.